The champagne had been flowing freely in the officers' mess at Chateau de Benouville when Oberst Heinrich Weber first heard the rumor that made him throw back his head and laugh until tears streamed down his weathered face. The Americans, those soft Hollywood cowboys who couldn't march in formation without tripping over their own bootlaces, were supposedly training men to jump out of perfectly good airplanes with nothing but silk parachutes and prayers, planning to drop them behind the Atlantic wall like some kind of circus act, and the very thought of it struck Weber and his fellow commanders as the most absurd joke the Allies had concocted yet, even more ridiculous than their pathetic raid on Dieppe that had ended in such spectacular failure. He remembered raising his glass to toast the idiocy of American military thinking, joined by Hauptmann Friedrich Wolff and Major Klaus Brenner, all of them veterans of the Eastern Front where they had seen real warriors, real soldiers who understood that war was won through discipline, through superior tactics, through the iron will of the Wehrmacht, not through theatrical stunts that belonged in a cinema rather than on a battlefield. "Let them come," Weber had declared, his voice thick with schnapps and certainty. "Let them float down from the sky like dandelion seeds, and we will pluck them from the air before their boots touch Norman soil." And the room had erupted in agreement. These hardened men who had survived Stalingrad's frozen hell, who had witnessed the might of German military engineering, who genuinely believed that the Atlantic Wall with its bunkers, mines, and carefully positioned artillery was impregnable, that Fortress Europe was exactly what Führer had promised. An unbreakable bastion that would shatter any Allied invasion like waves against granite cliffs. But what Weber and his laughing compatriots didn't understand, what they couldn't comprehend from their position of comfortable superiority, was that across the English Channel, in the muddy training grounds of England, something extraordinary was being forged in the crucible of relentless preparation. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were transforming farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, coal miners from Pennsylvania into something the world had never seen before, warriors, who would willingly hurl themselves from aircraft at 500 feet in the dead of night, carrying 80 pounds of equipment, knowing that the landing might kill them, that they might drift into flooded fields and drown, that they might be shot while dangling helpless in their harnesses. Yet they trained anyway, jumped anyway, because they understood something that the Germans in their arrogance had forgotten, that courage isn't the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it. Lieutenant James Murphy from Boston had vomited the first 12 times he jumped, his body rebelling against every instinct for self-preservation as he stood in the door of the C-47 with wind screaming past and the ground impossibly far below. But he had jumped anyway, and then jumped again and again until the fear became something he carried rather than something that carried him, until he could look at his men, boys really, most of them not yet 20, and convince them through his example, that they were not cattle being led to slaughter but eagles preparing to strike. Sergeant William Wild Bill Thompson from Texas had been a rodeo rider before the war, accustomed to 8-second rides on animals that wanted him dead, and he approached paratrooper training with the same fatalistic humor, joking that at least a parachute wouldn't try to gore him, though his laughter hid the meticulous way he checked every strap, every buckle, the way he memorized rally points and alternate plans, understanding that chaos was coming, that their carefully organized drop zones would become scattered nightmares, that everything that could go wrong would go wrong, and that success would depend on small groups of determined men, making split-second decisions in the dark. Private First Class Robert "Bobby" Chen from San Francisco carried the weight of being one of the few Chinese Americans in the Airborne, facing prejudice even from some of the men he would fight beside, but he had something to prove not just to them but to America itself, that his loyalty was unquestionable, that his courage was equal to any, and he trained harder than anyone, learned faster, became the soldier that others grudgingly respected even if they didn't want to, because excellence has a way of breaking through barriers that rhetoric cannot. These men and thousands like them, black soldiers in the segregated units who trained knowing they would have to be twice as brave to receive half the recognition. Native American pathfinders who used ancestral tracking skills to become the first boots on Norman ground, Jewish refugees who had fled European persecution and were now preparing to return as liberators. All of them converged in the spring of 1944 with a mission that seemed designed by madmen. Drop behind enemy lines in darkness, scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula, disrupt German communications, secure bridges and causeways, create chaos and confusion, hold positions until the beach landings could link up with them, and above all, survive. The planning was meticulous yet acknowledged the fundamental truth that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Pathfinders would jump first. to mark drop zones with lights and radar beacons, but they knew German anti-aircraft fire would scatter the formations, that cloud cover might obscure landmarks, that pilots flying through flak would take evasive action that would spread paratroopers across miles of French countryside. Each soldier carried an arsenal that seemed impossible for one man to bear. M1 Garand rifle or Thompson submachine gun, grenades, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, explosives, sometimes even a disassembled machine gun or mortar, all of it strapped to their bodies until they waddled like pregnant penguins toward the aircraft, and the dark humor flowed freely. If the chute doesn't open, I won't need a stretcher, they'll need a shovel and a bucket. Because laughter was armor against the growing certainty that many of them would not see June 7th. Meanwhile, back in Normandy, the German garrison had settled into a routine of comfortable confidence, posted to what they considered a backwater assignment compared to the Eastern Front, where the real war was being fought against Soviet hordes. Weber's intelligence reports confirmed what he already believed, that any Allied invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel, where it made logical sense, where German defenses were strongest, and even if the Allies were foolish enough to attempt Normandy, they would never be insane enough to try a night drop in weather this unpredictable, in terrain this unsuitable, across an area this heavily defended. The fields behind Utah and Omaha beaches had been deliberately flooded by Rommel's orders, turning the lowlands into swamps that would drown any paratrooper unlucky enough to land there, while the hedgerows, those ancient Norman bocage with their thick earthen walls and dense vegetation, would fragment any ground force, creating a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare, and the German positions covered every likely drop zone with interlocking fields of fire, making any daytime landing suicidal and any nighttime landing impossibly chaotic. What Weber didn't know, what none of them knew, was that chaos was precisely what the Allies were counting on, that the very impossibility of the mission was its greatest strength, because if the Germans believed it couldn't be done, they wouldn't adequately prepare for it being attempted. June 5, 1944, the day that would become June 6 in the Norman darkness, began with weather so foul that it seemed to validate German assumptions about invasion impossibility, with winds gusting to 30 miles per hour, cloud cover at 500 feet, and seas running so high that even the German weather stations reported that no amphibious assault could possibly proceed under these conditions, which is exactly what Eisenhower was counting on when he made the decision that would determine the fate of Western civilization, giving the order to launch Operation Overlord, to send the largest invasion force in human history across an angry channel toward a coast defended by the most powerful military machine Europe had ever seen. At airfields across southern England, the paratroopers blackened their faces with burnt cork and coal dust, some adding Indian war paint designs, others writing messages on their helmets. Hitler's worst nightmare, Kilroy will be there, airborne infantry, death from above. And they helped each other with the complex ritual of gearing up, checking parachutes one final time, ensuring leg bags were properly secured, main chutes packed correctly, reserve chutes accessible, weapons wrapped and protected, the whole process taking nearly an hour, transforming them from individual soldiers into a brotherhood of warriors about to attempt something that had never been done at this scale, in these conditions with stakes this high. Murphy gathered his stick, the 12 men who would jump from his plane, and gave them the same speech he'd given 100 times in training, reminding them of their rally points, their objectives, the recognition signals, thunder/welcome, flash/lightning, that would help them identify friends in the dark. But he also added something new, something he'd been saving. Gentlemen, a year ago most of you had never seen an airplane up close, let alone jumped out of one, and now you're about to make history, you're about to do something so audacious, so brave, so completely insane that your grandchildren will barely believe it. And I want you to remember that when things get tough down there, when you're scared and alone and the Germans are shooting at you from every direction, that you chose this, that you volunteered for the toughest training in the U.S. Army, that you earned those wings on your chest, and that means you're not ordinary soldiers, you're elite, you're airborne, and you're going to show those German sons of bitches what American fighting men can do. The C-47s, Goonie birds, the men called them affectionately, began taking off in the late afternoon of June 5th, wave after wave of them, 822 planes carrying 13,000 paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, plus additional Pathfinder units and British 6th Airborne Division heading for the eastern flank, the largest airborne operation ever attempted, and as they formed up over England and turned south toward France, the pilots could see the armada below, 5,000 ships carrying 160,000 men, and They understood that what they were doing was the crucial first act, that their success or failure would determine whether those men on the beaches lived or died. The flight across the channel was deceptively peaceful, the planes flying in tight formation, paratroopers sitting on uncomfortable metal benches, some sleeping despite the noise and vibration, others praying, reading letters from home one last time, or engaging in the nervous banter that soldiers have used since ancient times to push back against fear. Thompson led his stick in singing Blood on the Risers, the gallows humor airborne song about a paratrooper whose chute failed to deploy, the lyrics getting more grotesque with each verse, and by the end they were laughing, because if you can laugh at death, death has less power over you. But as they crossed the Norman coast, everything changed in an instant. The German anti-aircraft batteries that had been silent, assuming no attack could come in this weather, suddenly erupted in a storm of tracers and exploding shells, and the peaceful formation shattered as pilots took evasive action. Planes banking hard, dropping altitude, climbing, scattering, the careful organization dissolving into chaos as 88mm flak burst around them, filling the sky with shrapnel that tore through thin aluminum skin and softer human flesh. In Weber's command post, the phone rang with frantic reports from coastal observers, aircraft, hundreds of them, approaching from the channel, and he initially dismissed it as a diversionary raid, perhaps an unusually large bombing run. But then the reports kept coming. The planes weren't bombing, they were dropping something, parachutes, thousands of parachutes, and Weber felt the first cold finger of doubt touch his spine, because this wasn't supposed to happen, not here, not now, not in these impossible conditions. Murphy's plane took a hit from flak that killed the crew chief instantly and sent hydraulic fluid spraying through the cabin. But the pilot held course long enough to reach the drop zone, or what he hoped was the drop zone, because between the evasive maneuvers and the cloud cover, navigation had become pure guesswork, and Murphy stood in the door, wind screaming, flak bursting in orange flowers against the black sky, and he felt the tap on his shoulder that meant go, and he went, hurling himself into the screaming darkness at 500 feet with barely enough altitude for his chute to deploy, and in those 3 seconds of free fall before the canopy snapped open, he thought of his mother in Boston, his girl Mary who he'd promised to marry, the priest who'd blessed them before departure, and then the chute opened with a shock that felt like being grabbed by God's own hand, and suddenly he was floating in eerie silence broken only by the distant chatter of machine guns and the thump of artillery. Chen's plane was hit worse, the starboard engine catching fire, and the pilot was screaming at them to jump now, and they went out in a rush, one after another, not waiting for the green light or the proper drop zone, just getting out before the plane became a coffin, and Chun exited fifth in the stick, his chute deploying just as the plane behind them exploded in a fireball that lit up the entire sky, and in that terrible illumination he could see dozens of other parachutes, a snowstorm of silk descending on Normandy, and he could see the tracers reaching up toward them, lazy-looking red streaks that moved faster than perception, and he heard the scream as someone in his stick took a round before reaching the ground, the sound cutting off with terrible finality. Thompson landed in a flooded field exactly as the planners had warned, the impact driving him underwater with 80 pounds of equipment trying to drag him to the bottom, and he fought the instinct to panic, remembered his training, hit the quick release on his harness, shed the leg bag, and kicked upward, breaking the surface, gasping and flailing toward higher ground, collapsing in the mud, alive by the thinnest of margins, and as he lay there catching his breath he heard splashing nearby, another paratrooper struggling in the water, and he went back in and dragged the man out, not knowing if he was from his unit or his division or even his army, only knowing that they were brothers in this nightmare and you didn't leave brothers to drown. Murphy landed in an apple orchard, his parachute tangling in the branches, leaving him suspended 6 feet off the ground, and he hung there for a heart-stopping moment, completely vulnerable, expecting German bullets to cut him down. But there was only silence except for the distant sounds of combat, and he cut himself free, dropped to the ground, assessed his situation. Alone, equipment mostly intact, rifle functional, no idea where he was, and began searching for others using the cricket clicker that had seemed so silly in training but now was a lifeline, clicking twice and waiting for the answering click that meant friend not foe, and slowly, painfully, his scattered stick began to coalesce, 2 men here, 3 there, none of them where they were supposed to be, but all of them alive and armed and ready to fight. Across the Cotentin Peninsula, this scene repeated itself thousands of times, the carefully organized operation dissolving into what one historian would later call a strategic mess and a tactical success. because while almost no one landed where they were supposed to, while units were scattered across 20 miles instead of concentrated in drop zones, while commanders found themselves leading men they'd never met from units they'd never heard of, the very chaos created paralysis in the German command structure because reports flooded in from everywhere. Paratroopers at St. Miraglisse, paratroopers at Corentin, paratroopers cutting phone lines near Utah Beach, paratroopers attacking the causeway at La Fere, paratroopers everywhere and nowhere, in numbers that seemed impossible, and Weber and his fellow commanders suddenly faced the nightmare scenario where they couldn't tell where the main attack was coming because it seemed to be coming from all directions at once. At St. Miraglisse, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss led a scratch force of paratroopers from multiple units in an assault on the town square, where German soldiers were fighting a fire in a building while civilians watched, and the Americans dropped among them like avenging angels, and in the vicious close-quarters battle that followed, the paratroopers took the town in less than an hour, and Krauss personally raised an American flag, the first American flag to fly over liberated France, in a gesture that was equal parts military necessity and pure symbolic defiance, announcing to the Germans and the French and the world that the liberation of Europe had begun. Chen found himself with a group of 7 other paratroopers, none from his company, led by a sergeant he'd never met, tasked with an objective they weren't even sure how to reach, but the sergeant, a tough Oklahoma farmer named Hayes, simply said, "We're supposed to raise hell behind enemy lines, and boys, we are behind enemy lines, so let's raise some hell." And they set off through the bocage, using the hedgerows for cover, moving toward the sound of gunfire, engaging German patrols when they had to, avoiding them when they could, cutting every phone wire they found, mining every crossroads, becoming the chaos that the planners had envisioned, multiplying their numbers through audacity and aggression until every German in the sector believed he was facing a full company when it was just 7 men who refused to quit. Weber finally reached one of his forward positions just before dawn and found his men dug in and terrified, reporting that paratroopers were everywhere, that communications were cut, that units to the north and south weren't responding, and when Weber demanded to know numbers, how many paratroopers, what strength, were concentrated, his men had no answers because the Americans weren't concentrated, they were like mercury, small groups flowing around strong points, infiltrating between positions, attacking from unexpected directions, and Weber realized with dawning horror that the laughter in the officers' mess had been the laughter of fools, that the Americans had done something he would never have ordered because it was too risky, too chaotic, too dependent on the initiative of individual soldiers rather than the control of commanders, and that was exactly why it was working, because American training had prepared these paratroopers to think for themselves, to adapt, to accomplish the mission even when everything went wrong, while German training had prepared soldiers to follow orders and wait for direction from above. Thompson's group reached their primary objective, a bridge over the Douve River, only to find it already held by another paratrooper unit that had arrived from a completely different direction, and the two groups stared at each other for a moment before dissolving into laughter and backslapping, because against all odds, despite the scattered drop, despite the chaos, someone had reached the objective and held it, and that meant the plan was working, impossibly, improbably, the plan was working. As dawn broke on June 6th, the paratroopers who had survived the drop and the night's fighting found themselves in positions all across the Norman countryside, many still not knowing exactly where they were, but all understanding that the beach landings were coming, that men would be climbing out of Higgins boats into German machine gun fire, and that every German soldier the paratroopers kept busy inland was one less German shooting at the men on the beaches, and that gave them a clarity of purpose that transcended unit boundaries and rank structure. They had to hold, had to keep fighting, had to be the chaos that prevented German reinforcements from reaching the coast. Murphy's group, reinforced to nearly 30 men from 6 different companies, occupied a farmhouse overlooking a road that intelligence suggested would be a key German reinforcement route, and they prepared defensive positions, mined the approaches, positioned their one captured German machine gun to create a killing zone, and then they waited, listening to the distant thunder from the coast that they knew was the naval bombardment preceding the beach assault, and Murphy whispered to his men, "Boys on those beaches are counting on us. Don't matter that we're beat to hell. Don't matter that we're low on ammo. We're airborne and we hold." And they nodded, these exhausted, scattered, magnificent warriors who 12 hours earlier had been laughing nervously in English airfields and were now the tip of the spear that would crack open Fortress Europe. When the German column came, 2 companies of infantry with armored support, rushing toward Utah Beach to crush the landing, They ran straight into Murphy's killing zone, and the farmhouse erupted in fire, the captured German machine gun cutting through the lead elements, grenades raining down from upper windows, rifle fire so rapid and disciplined that the Germans believed they were facing a much larger force, and the column stalled, deployed, began trying to flank the farmhouse, and casualties, both sides pinned down, but Chen noticed that the German firing was disciplined, controlled, suggesting professional soldiers who wouldn't panic, and he suggested to Sergeant Hayes that maybe they didn't need to win this fight, maybe they just needed to keep these Germans busy, keep them from joining the defensive positions at the beach, and Hayes grinned and said, "Son, you just learned the most important lesson of infantry combat. Sometimes the mission is just to be a pain in the ass." And they settled in, rationing their ammunition, firing just enough to keep the Germans cautious, turning a tactical stalemate into a strategic victory by keeping enemy soldiers away from where they were needed most. Thompson's group had the most audacious mission, assigned by an ad hoc command structure that would have horrified peacetime army bureaucrats, to assault a German coastal battery that was shelling the beaches, and they approached through the pre-dawn darkness, a scratch force of 20 paratroopers who had probably never trained together, led by a captain from the 82nd, a lieutenant from the 101st, and sergeants from 3 different companies, united only by airborne wings and absolute determination, and they hit the battery from 3 sides simultaneously, grenades and gunfire and screaming battle cries that sounded more like Apache raiders than modern soldiers, and the German gun crews, already rattled by reports of paratroopers everywhere, broke and ran, leaving their guns silent just as the first landing craft were hitting the beaches, and though the paratroopers would never know it, their assault probably saved hundreds of lives on Utah Beach in those critical first minutes. By midday June 6th, the German command structure finally began to grasp the magnitude of what had happened. Not just that paratroopers had landed, but that they had accomplished their objectives despite catastrophic scattering, that small groups of Americans had caused damage and chaos, far beyond their numbers, that the Atlantic Wall had been breached not by overwhelming force but by audacity and courage and the willingness of individual soldiers to take initiative when plans dissolved, and Weber, surveying the disaster of his sector, understood finally what his laughter in the officers' mess had cost him. Not just tactical surprise but psychological defeat, because his men had been taught that Americans were soft, were untested, were inferior soldiers, and then these Americans had fallen from the sky in the middle of the night and fought like demons, and that shattered confidence in German superiority in a way that no propaganda could repair. The link-up between paratroopers and beach forces came throughout June 6th and 7th, and those meetings were emotional beyond description. Paratroopers who had fought isolated for 24 hours seeing American tanks rolling inland, infantry from the beaches seeing the exhausted, hollow-eyed paratroopers and understanding that these men had been holding the door open while they climbed the cliffs, and there was no rivalry between airborne and leg infantry in those moments, only shared respect, and relief that they had survived the longest day. The cost had been terrible. Over 2,000 paratroopers killed, wounded, or missing from the 82nd and 101st Airborne divisions, men who drowned in flooded fields, who were shot in their harnesses, who died taking objectives whose names most Americans would never learn, young men who had volunteered for the toughest training, who had jumped into the darkness, who had fought against odds that should have broken them but somehow didn't, because they carried something that couldn't be taught in training, or instilled through discipline. They carried the belief that free men fighting for a just cause could overcome any obstacle, could beat any odds, could win even when victory seemed impossible. Murphy survived, though he lost 6 of his original 12-man stick, including his best friend from basic training, and he never forgot standing in that farmhouse as the German column approached, never forgot the weight of knowing that everything depended on them holding that position. And for the rest of his life, when people thanked him for his service, he thought about the men who didn't come home, the boys who fell from the sky and never got up, who gave what Lincoln called the last full measure of devotion, so that others might live free. Chen earned a Silver Star for actions at a hedgerow crossroads where his group held off German counterattacks for 6 hours, though he never felt he deserved it, feeling instead that he'd just been doing what every other paratrooper was doing, refusing to quit, refusing to surrender, refusing to let down the men beside him who were depending on him just as he depended on them. And when he finally returned to San Francisco after the war, he wore his airborne wings with quiet pride, having proven to himself, if not to everyone else, that American courage came in all colors and had no accent. Thompson went on to fight through the rest of the war, jumping into Holland for Market Garden, holding the line at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, and he would say that nothing in his rodeo days prepared him for the combination of terror and exhilaration of combat, but that the jump into Normandy was special, was different, because it was the moment when theory became reality, when all the training and preparation and doubt crystallized into action, when they proved that the impossible was just another mission that needed completing, and whenever people asked him about D-Day, he would smile and say, "We scared the hell out of them Germans, dropping from the sky in the middle of the night, and you know what, we scared the hell out of ourselves too. But we did it anyway, and that's what being airborne means, doing it anyway." Weber survived the war as a prisoner, captured when his sector collapsed 3 days after the invasion, and in the POW camp he had time to reflect on that night in the officers' mess when he had laughed at the idea of American paratroopers, and he understood finally what his arrogance had blinded him to, that wars are won not by the side with the best weapons or the strongest fortifications, but by the side with soldiers willing to do whatever it takes, to endure whatever hardships are necessary, to jump out of airplanes in the middle of the night into enemy territory if that's what victory requires, and the Americans had that willingness in abundance, had it in those farm boys and factory workers and coal miners who became warriors, who fell from the sky like thunder and fought like lightning, who turned chaos into victory and impossibility into history. The invasion succeeded, the lodgment held, the breakout came, and within a year Nazi Germany lay in ruins. But it all began with those paratroopers, with 13,000 men who climbed into planes on the evening of June 5, 1944, who faced their fears and jumped anyway, who scattered across Normandy like seeds of liberation, who fought as individuals and small groups but achieved a collective victory that changed the course of human history. And in the years that followed, when people spoke of the greatest generation, they were speaking of men like Murphy and Chan and Thompson, young men who rose to meet an extraordinary challenge, who proved that courage and determination and belief in a just cause could overcome any obstacle, who didn't think of themselves as heroes but simply as soldiers doing their jobs, and who fell from the sky on D-Day and landed as legends.